Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of source material from Dare to Think called The Linguistic and Historical Subversion of Biblical Terminology. We're going to be looking into this wild historical mystery, how the ancient language of the first century faith was systematically reshaped by modern institutions. If you're into history, language, and, uncovering the hidden origins of the words we use every single day, you're going to find this absolutely eye-opening.
The entire analysis we're looking at today rests on this one central, honestly pretty provocative question. Did politics deliberately rewrite biblical language? The source material presents a super bold thesis here. They argue that political forces and state-sanctioned institutions intentionally altered original apostolic terminology. The claim is that this wasn't just some innocent accident of history or a simple mistranslation, but a systematic change designed to consolidate institutional power and create a hierarchy that literally never existed in the original texts.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the chronological mystery we're about to unpack. We'll start with the subversion premise, then hit the Constantine pivot, look at hijacking the language, the temple and tithe, the translation crisis, and finally, reconstructing the faith.
All right, starting right off with Section 1, the subversion premise. To really grasp the author's foundational argument here, we have to understand that our modern religious words have kind of detached us from the raw reality of the original first-century faith. Just take the foundational Greek word, ecclesia. Back in the first century, it didn't mean a religious building at all. It actually meant a lawful civic assembly of citizens, like a radical called-out gathering. The source highlights that the people themselves were the gathering, completely devoid of all that ritualistic architecture we immediately associate with the word church today.
Let's move right into Section 2, the Constantine pivot. Let's move to the timeline here and see how this builds, because the source identifies the 4th century as literally the most destructive epoch for Christian terminology. Let's trace this collision with the empire. In the 1st century, you have these persecuted, completely non-hierarchical house assemblies. But then, in 313 AD, the Edict of Milan integrates the faith directly into the Roman state. So from the 4th century onward, you see this massive shift from everyday living rooms to these huge public Roman basilicas and imperial structures.
Now, the article points out something really crucial here. Conflating a radical gathering of people with these physical Roman-style buildings caused a massive psychological shift from an assembly to a venue. You go from an original concept focused entirely on the people, communal meals, and physical fellowship, to this idea of a venue based on infrastructure. Fun fact here, Roman basilicas were originally massive judicial and governmental buildings, essentially ancient courthouses. By shifting the focus away from the people and onto this imposing infrastructure, the source argues the faith fundamentally changed how its followers viewed themselves.
Which brings us to Section 3, hijacking the language.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how, as the faith became a literal component of state power, the original vocabulary of service was systematically replaced. Notice how the word episkopos was transformed. The source points out that in its original Greek context, an episkopos was just a humble servant or overseer caring for the assembly's needs. But look at the institutional translation. It becomes bishop. So a word meant to describe a humble servant was hijacked to describe a political entity, a regional governor or bureaucratic administrator managing state-controlled territory. And we see the exact same thing happen with the Greek word hierarchos. The original context of this word specifically described the Old Covenant mediator at the temple altar. The author emphasizes that this Greek word is never, not even once, applied to a New Testament leader in the original texts. Yet the institutional translation became priest. The article asserts that translating leaders as priests actually violates New Covenant theology, because it reinstitutes this mediatorial, separate clerical class, creating a huge barrier with the everyday people that the apostles simply never intended.
All right, shifting gears a bit to Section 4, the temple and tithe.
Because as you'll see, these changing definitions weren't just academic. They had some severe practical and financial consequences for the followers. Let's look at the temple. The New Testament definition of the temple was the body of believers energized by the Holy Spirit. The people were the temple. But historical development insisted on building these massive physical structures and labeling those the house of God. The author argues this created an immediate, frankly desperate need for mandatory funds to sustain those buildings, rather than just caring for the community.
Because think about it. How do you fund those massive buildings? You need a system. The source breaks down how the New Testament model of voluntary, cheerful, sacrificial giving was completely replaced by the tithe model. The author points out that the tithe was actually an Old Testament agrarian tax system designed to support the Levitical priesthood. According to this analysis, it wasn't a New Testament mandate at all, but rather reclaimed as an instrument of modern compliance specifically to fund these unbiblical institutions.
And this brilliantly illustrates the source's central metaphor, the Old Covenant husk. The source argues that these modern state church institutions basically reached back into the past, grabbed the obsolete husk of the Old Covenant, like the physical temple and the tithe, and dragged them into the modern era just to ensure their own institutional survival.
Let's jump ahead to Section 5, the translation crisis.
So, you might be wondering, how did these distorted words actually get locked into the English language permanently? Exploring the 1500s, William Tyndale recognized this linguistic subversion. He boldly pushed to use the word congregation instead of church, knowing full well church was an institutional word. Tragically, Tyndale was martyred for opposing this religious system. Fast forward to 1611, the King James Version is published, and it effectively cements this hierarchical terminology into the language for centuries.
So, the crucial point is captured perfectly in this quote. By 1611, the English crown required a translation that upheld the existing hierarchy. The article impartially lays out the claim that state-church alliances deliberately preserved words like bishop and priest to maintain political stability. They basically put a veneer of divine authority over state interests.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Reconstructing the Faith.
To summarize this historical degeneration we've been tracking, moving from a vibrant, decentralized community to a state-intertwined religious system, the source presents a really clear call to action. Quote, "It is necessary to excise this religious vocabulary and return to the specific, actionable meanings of the Greek original." The author challenges readers to essentially dismantle centuries of linguistic imposition, to reconstruct the raw, original faith as it was first delivered.
We've covered a lot of ground today, tracing how the language of a decentralized movement was co-opted to build empires in physical institutions, which leaves us with a final, pretty thought-provoking question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If our words so fundamentally shape our reality, what other original truths might be hiding right behind the vocabulary of power we use every day? Keep questioning, keep digging, and as always, let the evidence guide you.